She was already bleeding when I walked through the door. That's the image I can't shake loose, no matter how many mornings pass. My daughter standing in her own dining room, one arm wrapped around her ribs, lips split open, and a 5-year-old girl pressed against her legs trying to make herself invisible. I've stood in combat situations. I've ordered men into weather that could kill them. I have never, in 68 years of living, felt the specific weight of that moment. Because the man responsible was someone I had invited into my family. Someone I had trusted. And some part of me, the part I have to live with now, had seen the warning signs long before that night and decided keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping people safe. It isn't. That's the first thing I need to tell you. My name is Walter Greer. I'm a retired Coast Guard commandant. Widower. Grandfather. I live in a small house on the marsh outside Savannah, Georgia, close enough to the water that I can hear the tide shifting at night when I can't sleep. Most evenings I'm in my workshop tinkering with things that don't need fixing: old radios, outboard motors, broken clocks. It's the kind of quiet life I thought I'd earned. The kind of quiet that unravels the moment your phone buzzes at 11 at night and 3 words hit you like cold water. Blue ribbon, Daddy. I stared at that message for longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand it. I understood it immediately, and that's exactly why my hands went numb. My daughter Mara and I created that phrase the winter after her mother died of a stroke without warning. Mara was 13. She was wearing this enormous gray hoodie she'd stolen from my closet, sitting on the edge of her mother's hospital bed the night after the funeral, and she asked me something I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. What if I'm scared someday, Dad? And I can't find the right words. So we made a code. Blue ribbon meant, don't ask questions, don't hesitate, just come. She hadn't used it in 22 years. I called her immediately, straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. By the 3rd call, I was already in my truck. Outside, rain moved across the Savannah marshes in slow curtains. Spanish moss hung heavy and dark from the live oaks lining my road. I drove through it barely registering the weather, my mind assembling fragments I hadn't wanted to look at directly. Mara wearing long sleeves in August. The way she laughed too quickly after her husband Cliff said something unkind in front of company. The way my granddaughter Sadie went very still whenever a door slammed. I had noticed all of it. I had filed it away under the comfortable category of couple stuff and kept my distance the way you do when you're afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of being right. That's the honest version. I called my old friend Dennis Calloway before I reached the highway. Dennis did 26 years with federal law enforcement before retiring to a house in Tybee Island, where he grows tomatoes and pretends he doesn't miss the work. He answered on the second ring, voice raspy from sleep. Walt. I told him Mara had sent the code. There was a pause, the kind that means someone is already putting their shoes on. How long a drive? 40 minutes, I said. I'll meet you at the corner of Whitaker and Anderson. He hung up before I could answer. I drove. Country music played through one tinny speaker and I couldn't hear a word of it. I kept thinking about Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Cliff had criticized Mara's sweet potato casserole in front of his parents, not yelling. Worse than that, using the quiet, patient voice of someone explaining something to a child who keeps making the same mistake. Mara had laughed and said she'd do better next. Yintra was shaking when she refilled the water glasses. I saw it. I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place. I sit with that decision regularly now. I sit with it like a stone in my chest. Dennis was already parked when I arrived, his old green Bronco idling near the corner with its lights off. He climbed into my passenger seat wearing jeans and a canvas jacket, rain beaded on his shoulders, and said without preamble, "You carrying?" I nodded. He nodded back once like that settled something. We drove the last 6 minutes in near silence, passing through streets of old Savannah row houses, with their gas lanterns burning orange through the rain. Mara and Cliff lived in one of those newer developments south of Forsyth Park, the kind of neighborhood that looks like a magazine spread if you don't look too closely. Big porches, professional landscaping, houses close enough together that everyone could theoretically hear everything and collectively chose not to. Cliff had picked it specifically because it had the right address. That was always the priority with Cliff. Appearance over substance, every time. I parked across the street. Mara's porch light was on. Sadie's little red wagon was tipped sideways in the driveway, filled with rainwater now. And then clearly, even through the closed windows and the rain, I heard Cliff's voice. Not the words. The register. That loud, escalating tone men use when they want control and feel it slipping. Dennis looked at me. Police now? I kept watching the house. Then I heard Sadie, not crying loudly. Worse. That small, swallowed-sounding crying children do when they've learned not to be heard. I was out of the truck before I finished the thought. We crossed the street in the rain at the pace of 2 men who have learned the hard way that running telegraphs panic. My jacket was soaked through before we reached the walkway. I could hear Cliff clearly now through the front window. "Your father can't walk in here and act like he owns my family." Something crashed. Glass, probably. I reached the front door. I want to be honest with you about what I felt standing there. It wasn't rage. Rage is simple. What I felt was something older and colder, the specific dread of a man who realizes the damage was already happening, and he was standing outside in the rain while it did. I opened the door without knocking. The smell came first. Whiskey and something burnt in the kitchen, and underneath it all, that particular staleness of a house where tension has been living for a long time. Mara was near the dining room table, one arm held awkwardly against her ribs, blood visible at the corner of her mouth. Sadie was partially hidden behind Mara's legs, wearing pajamas printed with little sea turtles, her face tracked with tears she was trying to make silent. Cliff stood at the kitchen island with a glass of bourbon in his hand, looking not like a man who had just committed violence, but like a man interrupted in the middle of making a reasonable point. The moment he saw me, his whole face shifted. "Walter." "Hey. This isn't what it looks like." Liars always say that exact sentence. I have noticed this across decades. It never changes. Sadie saw me and ran. She crossed the room in 3 steps and hit my chest hard enough that I rocked backward, her small hands gripping my shirt so tightly it pulled. She was shaking. Not fear of the dark shaking. Deep, bone-level trembling. I held her against me and felt something in my chest physically hurt. "Okay, sweetheart," I said into her hair. "You go with Mr. Dennis to find something to eat, all right?" Dennis had already crouched down to her level, completely calm, like a man built for exactly this. "Hey kiddo, think you can show me where the crackers are?" Sadie looked at him for one moment with enormous wet eyes, then let go of my shirt and took his hand. I will be grateful to Dennis Calloway for that until the day I die. Mara wouldn't look at me directly. That hurt more than the blood. Cliff tried a short laugh. Look, couples argue. Rachel got upset, started throwing things. He gestured at the broken glass near the living room wall. "You can see I'm the one," Mara said his name quietly. He kept talking. I took 1 step forward. "Just one." He stopped. "I'm taking Mara and Sadie with me tonight," I said. "You can't do that." The entitlement in his voice was something I'd heard before, men who mistake possession for love. "They're my family." "They're leaving," I said again. Mara moved toward the hallway, and Cliff grabbed her arm. Not gently. She gasped, and for half a second I saw her flinch in a way that told me this was not the first time her body had memorized that particular pain. Something very cold and very clear moved through me then. I have spent my career making decisions under pressure. I understand the difference between emotion and clarity. This was clarity. I walked until I was 2 feet from him. Cliff was younger than me by 25 years, taller by 2 inches, and drunk enough to feel untouchable. But his eyes changed when he looked into mine. I kept my voice very quiet. "Take your hands off my daughter." Nobody moved. Then Cliff released her arm with a small, contemptuous smile. "What are you going to do, old man?" I want to pause here because that question deserves an honest answer. I had 35 years of training and instinct screaming at me to do something physical. I understood in that moment exactly what my body wanted to do, and I understood with equal clarity that doing it would give Cliff exactly what he needed, a story where he was the victim. So I stood there and let the silence do the work instead. If you have ever had to hold yourself still while everything in you wanted to act, you know what that costs. You know exactly what I mean. The police arrived 17 minutes later. 2 Savannah patrol cars easing to the curb without sirens, rain dripping from the oaks overhead. By then, Cliff had done the thing I feared most. He'd sobered up just enough to become careful. That's the terrifying thing about men like him. Not the anger. The switch. One moment screaming at my daughter. The next standing in the kitchen looking bewildered and cooperative, talking to the responding officer in the patient voice of a man who has been unfairly caught in a misunderstanding. Officer Renata Brooks asked Mara directly, "Did your husband strike you tonight?" Mara looked at Cliff before answering. That one instinct, checking the room before speaking honestly, told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been happening. "We both got upset," she whispered. I closed my eyes for a moment. Officer Brooks was patient and kind, and experienced enough not to push harder than the situation allowed. Without Mara's cooperation, there would be no arrest that night. Cliff sat in the living room looking wounded. At one point he sighed and said he thought her father had escalated the situation. Dennis, standing beside me, didn't react visibly. But I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking it too. By midnight, Mara had packed 2 bags with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Sadie came down the hallway carrying a stuffed manatee backpack, half asleep, thumb near her mouth. Cliff followed Mara from room to room, saying things designed to sound reasonable but function as chains. You're scaring Sadie more by leaving. You're letting your father tell you what to do. You know nobody else will understand you the way I do. Each sentence perfectly calibrated. Each one a hook. As Mara zipped Sadie's jacket at the front door, Cliff's voice went soft. Mare, come on. And I watched, God help me, I watched confusion cross my daughter's face for half a second. That gravitational pull backward victims experience when the person hurting them suddenly sounds like the person they fell in love with. Then Sadie took Mara's hand and said very quietly, Mommy, please, can we go? That broke whatever spell remained. We walked out into the rain. The drive back to my place on the marsh was quiet except for the windshield wipers and Sadie making small sniffling sounds in the back seat. Mara stared out the window the whole way. Dennis followed us in his Bronco until I pulled into my driveway, then flashed his lights once and kept going. Mara and I didn't talk much that first night. I made coffee. She held the mug without drinking it, staring at the kitchen table like she was trying to remember how to be somewhere safe. Sadie fell asleep on my couch under 3 blankets almost immediately, still clutching the manatee. Around 2 in the morning, Dennis left. Before going, he stopped beside me on the porch. This isn't new, Walt. I already knew. How bad do you think? Worse than I let myself believe, I told him. He nodded once. Call me in the morning. I didn't sleep. At 4 a.m., I was sitting alone in the kitchen when Mara walked in wearing one of her old high school sweatshirts. She still kept in my guest closet. We sat across from each other for a long moment without speaking. Then she asked me something that I will carry for the rest of my life. Do you hate me for staying? I had to look at the table for a moment before I could answer her. No, I finally said. I hate that you thought you had to. Mara started crying after that. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the exhausted, sustained crying of someone who has been holding themselves together through an act of pure will for years and years and has finally put it down. I sat across from her and didn't try to make it stop. Sometimes people need to be allowed to grieve what happened to them without someone immediately trying to fix it. If you have ever loved someone who minimized their own pain to protect you from worrying, you know what it is to sit in a room with them while they finally stop pretending. It is one of the harder things a person can witness, and one of the most important. Over the next hour, pieces came out. Cliff had controlled nearly every financial account they held jointly. He checked her phone. He initiated arguments before family events, so she would seem volatile to anyone who witnessed the aftermath. He criticized her parenting, her appearance, her choices not constantly, but in patterns, in cycles, with enough warmth in between to keep her questioning her own perception. And when he drank, every dial got turned up. How long? I asked, when she paused. She looked at her coffee. He hit me the first time when Sadie was 18 months old. I stood up from the table. I walked into my garage. I put my fist through the front of a metal storage cabinet hard enough to leave a dent and feel pain shoot up my forearm. I stood there for about 30 seconds just breathing. Then Mara appeared in the doorway behind me. She looked at my hand, then at me. You never hit Mom, she said softly. I laughed once, without humor. No, I said, but I missed plenty. Dennis came by the following afternoon with sandwiches and a legal pad. He had spent the morning pulling public records, cross-referencing financial documents Mara had access to through shared tax filings, and making a few careful phone calls to people he trusted from his working years. Laid across my dining table. Hotel charges Mara had never known about, luxury purchases, restaurant bills, and this one made my stomach turn the steady, methodical draining of Sadie's education account over the past 3 years. Mara covered her mouth. Cliff had borrowed against it, then against it again, always with some corporate-adjacent explanation: liquidity, temporary bridge financing, restructuring. He'd gradually maneuvered Mara into signing digital documents mixed in with legitimate paperwork, sometimes late at night after arguments when her judgment was compromised and her need for peace was overwhelming. The account I had spent retirement bonuses and birthday gifts and Christmas checks building for my granddaughter's future nearly empty. I sat down because my legs stopped cooperating. I also need to tell you something that cost me to admit. I helped Cliff get his first serious job interview through old Coast Guard contacts. I helped with the down payment on their first home. I vouched for his character to people who trusted my word. I thought I was investing in my daughter's happiness. I was financing the infrastructure of her captivity. That's the sentence I had to sit with. That's the part nobody tells you about these situations. Sometimes love makes you complicit without knowing it. And then one day you're sitting at your own kitchen table staring at an empty account number and the math of your mistakes becomes unavoidable. A week later, Dennis connected us with an attorney named Carmen Whitfield. Carmen was 61, a former Chatham County prosecutor with short silver locks and the kind of calm that only comes from having seen every variety of human cruelty without being destroyed by it. She walked into my house, looked at the documents Dennis had assembled, and spent 2 hours working through bank records, text threads, account transfers, and Cliff's own preliminary divorce filings, which it turned out he had been quietly preparing for nearly 6 months. He had been planning his exit while draining the family finances. He had never stopped performing the role of devoted husband while building the infrastructure of his departure. Carmen looked at Mara directly when she finished reviewing. "Your husband committed financial abuse, possibly fraud, potentially embezzlement." She said it the way doctors deliver diagnoses cleanly, without softening it into something it isn't. "He told me none of it mattered because we were married," Mara said. Carmen shook her head. "That's not how this works." Then Mara asked the real question, the one that had been underneath everything since the beginning. "What if he gets Sadie?" Carmen's voice shifted slightly. Not soft, but human. Family courts do not look kindly on documented physical abuse, financial deception, or the deliberate depletion of a child's education fund. Then she looked at Mara with the patience of someone who has watched many women standing at exactly this door. "But I need you to be ready to stop protecting him." Mara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Sadie was riding her bike slowly up and down the driveway, the creek and Spanish moss visible beyond the fence at the end of the yard. Finally, Mara breathed in and nodded once. 3 weeks later, Cliff walked into the Coastal Georgia Heritage Gala at the DeSoto Hotel on Liberty Street, believing his life was stabilizing. The gala happened every spring, old Savannah money mixed with new corporate ambition and the kind of political figures who attend every public event just to be seen attending. Cliff had been nominated for a Regional Business Leadership Award by his company. He arrived in a charcoal suit that fit the room perfectly, shaking hands like a man who has fully convinced himself the crisis had been managed. "I want to be honest with you, I almost didn't go. Standing in my bedroom that afternoon, knotting a tie I hadn't worn in 2 years, I thought, this man is not worth ruining a perfectly good evening." But Carmen had asked me to be present, and Dennis had said simply, "Walt, you've been 15 minutes late to this situation for long enough." He was right. I wore my navy blazer and gray slacks and sat near the back with Dennis, who was nursing sparkling water and watching the room with the stillness of a man who has spent his life watching rooms. Carmen moved through conversations near the front, like she was on a slow walk through a garden, unhurried and exact. Cliff noticed me around 8 o'clock. I watched his expression move from surprise to irritation in less than a second. He crossed the room with his bourbon and stopped in front of me with a smile designed to look cordial. "Didn't expect to see you here, Walter." I told him the salmon looked good. That annoyed him, which was the point. Mara arrived at 8:30 with Carmen. Dark blue dress, hair back simply, no jewelry except her grandmother's earrings. She looked like herself. Not the version of herself that had been wearing Cliff's preferences for years. Her. When Cliff spotted her across the ballroom, something shifted in his posture, the first crack in the performance. He moved toward her immediately. And that's where things began unraveling. Because he was no longer the only one who had been preparing. Earlier that week, Carmen had quietly provided documentation to Cliff's employer about irregularities in his expense reimbursements, not accusations, just records, enough to trigger internal review. Separately, a man named Marcus Holt had received an envelope containing photographs and hotel receipts he had not requested. Marcus was 47, an attorney with a local television profile, and the husband of a woman named Delia who had been appearing in those photos with Cliff for approximately 8 months. Nobody orchestrated a scene. Real life rarely works that way. What happens is quieter and more permanent. Pressure builds until the structure can no longer hold its own weight. By 8:45, you could feel the room changing. People checking phones, certain conversations dying mid-sentence. Cliff's company associates becoming suddenly interested in the centerpieces. Marcus Holt arrived through the main entrance and crossed the ballroom toward Delia without drama, without theater, with only the quiet devastation of a man who has been handed proof of something he had hoped was not true. 2 men in dark blazers entered through the side door and moved toward Cliff with the unhurried certainty of people who know their subject has nowhere to go. I watched Cliff try to manage 5 different conversations simultaneously. I watched his drink hand tighten. I watched the precise moment he understood that the room he had been performing in for years had stopped being his audience and started being his record. His eyes found mine across the ballroom, and for one moment I saw it clearly, not anger anymore, something smaller. He had needed, his entire life, for someone to tell him he was winning, and everyone had stopped. He turned to Mara. "You let your father do this." His voice was still controlled, but the edges were fraying. You destroyed our family because you couldn't handle a hard year. Mara looked at him. No fear in her face, no pull backward. She looked like someone who had finally stopped being surprised by the things he said. The company investigators reached them. Mr. Barwell, we need a few minutes. Cliff ignored them and stepped closer to Mara. Several people nearby turned openly now. I gave you everything, he said, louder. You owe me. Mara's voice was quiet, perfectly quiet. I stayed silent for years. She paused. I'm done protecting you. Not the investigators, not the nearby guests, not me, though I felt the words land somewhere behind my sternum and stay there. Then one of the company men touched Cliff's shoulder lightly. Sir. And Cliff, for the first time in the 12 years I had known him, had nothing left to say. As they walked him toward the side exit, he looked back twice. Not at Mara, not at me. At the room, like he was still hoping the audience would change their minds. The room did not change its mind. Mara stood very still for a moment after he disappeared. Then she exhaled a long, slow breath and looked at me. I walked over and she leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. Neither of us said anything. Sometimes silence is the right thing. 4 months later, I was standing in my kitchen on a Saturday morning making blueberry pancakes while Sadie sat at the counter with great seriousness explaining to me the difference between manatee intelligence and dolphin intelligence. Apparently dolphins were emotionally smarter, but manatees were wiser. I didn't challenge this. The coffee was ready before sunrise. Cartoons played low in the next room. Sadie kept stealing blueberries when she thought I wasn't looking, which I had been letting her do deliberately for 3 weeks. Mara came in wearing sweatpants and one of my old Coast Guard hoodies that she'd claimed from my closet sometime around age 15 and never returned. There was color in her face. That still surprised me sometimes, the color. For a long time, my daughter had looked like someone surviving rather than living. 2 different things. Now she looked tired in ordinary ways. Work tired. Mom tired. The kind of tired that comes from a life you are actually living rather than enduring. She poured coffee and leaned against the counter watching Sadie, and I asked carefully how therapy was going. Hard, she said, but good. That, I have come to understand, is the most honest answer. Leaving is not the finish line. Often it's only where the real repair work begins, the slow, unsexy work of learning to trust your own perceptions again, of rebuilding a self that someone else spent years dismantling piece by piece. Cliff's company terminated him following the audit. Carmen handled the legal proceedings with the precision I'd expected of someone with her history. The divorce was not clean or fast. These things never are on television and almost never are in life, but the outcome protected Mara and Sadie in the ways that mattered most. I also rebuilt Sadie's education account, not all at once. Military pensions are comfortable, not lavish, but between recovered settlement funds, careful restructuring through Carmen's guidance, and a few extra deposits on birthdays and Christmas, her future no longer felt stolen. There's one other thing I need to tell you, and it's the part I'm least proud of. About a month after the gala, I sat with Mara on the back porch watching evening settle across the marsh. The tide was going out, fireflies starting up along the water's edge. I told her I was sorry I hadn't pushed harder, hadn't asked the right questions, hadn't trusted what I'd seen in those small moments over the years. She shook her head immediately. You saw exactly what I let you see, she said. I wanted to accept that. I understand why she offered it. But the truth is more complicated, and I think she knows it too. The truth is that I had been afraid of being wrong, afraid of being unwelcome, afraid that pushing would make things worse. And so I stayed comfortable in my restraint while my daughter was not comfortable in her house. I sit with that. I think I'll sit with it for a long time, not as punishment, as instruction. This story taught me something specific about attention. Not the dramatic, obvious kind, not the split lip, not the broken glass, the quiet kind, the long sleeves in July, the apologizing too fast, the flinch when a voice rises. These are the signs that live in the space between what we notice and what we allow ourselves to know. Most of us see them. Most of us file them away under something safer. The question I want to leave you with is this. Is there someone in your life who is slowly disappearing into themselves while you wait for it to become obvious enough to act? Because by the time it's obvious, it's already been going on for years. One afternoon last June, Sadie and I were sitting on the dock, eating popsicles that were melting faster than we could finish them. She asked me if I had been a hero in the Coast Guard. I laughed. Not really, I told her. She frowned. But Mama says you saved us. The marsh stretched out behind us, egrets wading in the shallows, boats rocking gently at the far dock. I thought about what that word means and what it costs and what it actually looks like from the inside. Heroes are just people who finally show up when it matters, I told her. The important part is the finally. Sadie considered this with the gravity only 5-year-olds can bring to a conversation. Then she nodded and went back to her popsicle. That night, after Mara and Sadie were both asleep, I sat alone on the back porch with one last cup of coffee and listened to the marsh at night, the frogs, the water, the distant moan of a barge on the river. Life had gotten quiet again. But this time the quiet didn't feel like something waiting to break. It felt earned, real quiet. The kind that sits in your chest like something you've been given rather than something you've lost. So here's what I'm asking you today. Comment below with a 1, 2, or 3. A 1 if you think I handled that night the right way. A 2 if you think I should have acted sooner and harder. And a 3 if this story reminded you of something in your own life that you haven't talked about yet. I want to know. Also, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? And if you have ever loved someone who was quietly disappearing and you didn't know quite how to reach them, I'd be grateful if you shared that in the comments. You don't have to give details, just knowing you're out there matters. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing. There are more of these true, human, complicated stories about people trying to do the right thing, usually imperfectly, usually too late, and doing it anyway. I'll be here every week. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Savannah, Georgia, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.